so yesterday we talked about the first attempt at a national government for the United States. What was the name of that first government? Very good. The Articles of Confederation. And it created a confederation, which how could we describe a confederation? What would that mean? Yes? Right. So we're coming together to form some kind of a group, some kind of a central government. You know, we're united to a degree, but is it a very strong thing? Yeah. So it's kind of like, okay, we're going to form like a club or something, and we do a couple of things together, but you still get to hang out and do whatever you want to do. You can hang out with other people. You can make your own rules for things. You can, pretty much decide what you want to do on a day-to-day basis. We're just going to do these things together, usually again for defense in this case. So they intentionally created a very weak central government made up of a one-house Congress. Every state represented the same in that one-house Congress. But they end up creating something that was so weak it could barely function. What were some of the powers that they didn't grant that Congress that ended up causing a really big problem? Right, they can't coin money or print money. So the states were doing that. What big problem was that causing? Inflation. So a big inflation problem as well as disputes and arguments over that. Good. Big one, probably what a lot of historians would argue is the most important one, that they couldn't tax. And because they couldn't tax, what problem were they running into? Can't pay off debts from the war, have no money to function. Very good. They can't control trade. And so what were the states doing because the national government could not regulate? Right. The states are taxing each other. They're arguing with each other. It's nearly erupting into civil war. There's no executive. There's no way to actually enforce anything that Congress might do, even if they have the authority to do it. Things like the Treaty of Paris, therefore, being violated on both sides. And so there are numerous problems. They're not really able to get together to fix it. And so within 10 years here, what we have is a bunch of squabbling states. They're flat broke, can't make good on their treaties. A lot of people are beginning to become quite concerned that this just simply isn't working. On the other hand, you still had numerous people that said, hey, we got some problems, but ultimately this is a good system. And there are a lot of things about it that some states and some individuals do like, so keep that in mind. So there's lots of problems and there's lots of calls for reform. There were lots of individuals that were very worried and concerned that this was all about to just fall apart, that they were about to just fall apart and everything that they had worked so hard for, and that they had pulled off this miraculous victory against Britain, that it was all just about to go down the drain. The event that kind of sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back, as the expression goes, the thing that kind of becomes the breaking point that pushes certainly not all people, but certainly enough people to say, we got to do something, was an incident that occurred in Massachusetts known as Shays Rebellion. So this happens in Massachusetts, and this Shays here was a man named Daniel Shays, and Daniel Shays and his followers that were committing this rebellion, this insurrection with him, they were mostly farmers, poor, indebted farmers. What does that mean if they were indebted? They're in debt. Okay, they're farmers that are in debt, which is quite common for smaller farmers. Farming is a very debt-ridden business. You put all your money into harvesting your crop and kind of hope for the best when harvest time comes. And so it was quite common for farmers like Daniel Shays to be in a constant cycle of debt and to be kind of downtrodden and poor. And people like Daniel Shays, not only were they constantly in debt for various reasons, but one of the reasons is because they're being taxed. There were a lot of heavy taxes on these farmers and their property. You might say, well, I thought the government couldn't tax. The national government can, but the states can. So the state of Massachusetts was putting very, very high taxes on lots of different groups, including people like Daniel Shays. And that hit people like Daniel Shays very hard because these were people that didn't have a whole lot of money to begin with. And so a lot of people like Daniel Shays found they couldn't pay their taxes. and couldn't pay their mortgages. And so when they couldn't pay their taxes and they couldn't pay their mortgages, the payments on their land, what starts to happen to them? They start losing their land. Yeah, so their land's being confiscated, their farms are being foreclosed upon, and so they're not very happy about that. Now, why do you suppose, besides the fact, just the simple fact that their land's being taken, what other argument do you think Daniel Shays and his people may have of why this isn't right? Okay, so they can't take care of how they're going to provide for themselves? Yes, they're going to say this is unfair taxation. They're going to say we just fought a war. These people are war veterans, most of them. We just fought a war against unfair taxation. We just fought a war against a country, a government that was not looking out in the interests of the people, and we have just 10 years later come right back to the same problem. This is just like where we were. This is no good. So they are using the same kind of arguments. They're saying this is an unfair situation. This is unfair taxation, and we're going to rebel against it. And that we're justified in doing that. So Daniel Shays and his followers for a couple of weeks are running around the countryside in Massachusetts, busting up the courthouses, going into the courthouses and disrupting the court proceedings where they were confiscating people's land and trying to stop all of that. Now let's just say for a moment, let's imagine for a moment something like this happened today. Some people got mad about something, let's say land confiscation, whatever, and they grab their weapons and all this stuff and they head down to the courthouse. What do you think's going to happen? Okay, what if it was so many people that the police were overwhelmed, they couldn't handle it? Okay, eventually we'd probably expect the military to come in, right? And even if it was more, let's say it was so big and it just stirred up so many people that even, the National Guard couldn't handle it, we would probably expect, the federal government to declare a state of emergency or something. And we know, regardless of how you feel about it, that's kind of, we would expect them to respond, right? We would expect something to happen. How do you think the national government responded in this situation? They couldn't. Why not? There's no executive to streamline the action. What else? Well, technically they do, because technically they do have the power to raise an army, but what do they not have? Well, there's not really one available, but even so, then from the money, all that costs money. And so the national government's response was, sorry, can't help you. They were powerless to do anything about this. Not because they didn't technically have the authority. Technically they did, but they were too disorganized, and probably more importantly, they did not have the money. There was no funding to raise troops and to try to put this down. So here we had people in armed rebellion against their government, and the government could not respond. Now, eventually, Shays Rebellion is put down. It is put down by Massachusetts. Eventually, Massachusetts is able to gather up enough of their own militia to round it up and stop it, and people like Daniel Shays are arrested. Most of them don't go to jail for very long. A lot of them actually end up getting elected to office not too long after that. So that was concerning to some people as well. But the point is this. What do you think this demonstrated to a lot of people? Something's got to change, exactly. This demonstrated to many people, proved to enough people that they had to do something, that this government was dangerously weak, that if they did not do something to strengthen the national government, then what's to stop something like this from happening again? And next time they might be successful. We're going to collapse into anarchy and civil war and mob rule. If we do not strengthen the national government, we are going to end up in chaos and violence and bloodshed and all of that. And there's other class issues going on here as well. And the fact that a lot of these people ended up elected to office concerned a lot of folks. The fact that Massachusetts was taxing as heavily as they were concerned some people. So it is Shays Rebellion that kind of becomes sort of the catalyst, the spark that leads to real conversation about fixing the articles, about trying to actually address this. There's been talk of it, but nothing had ever amounted from any of those talks. But this is where enough people are like, okay, we may disagree on what needs to happen, but we got to try. We can't just sit here and allow this to happen. So it is within the months following Shays Rebellion. There'll first be a meeting they will have in Maryland where a handful of states will show up, and there they agree they've got enough support and enough people interested to have a bigger meeting. And so this is going to lead to extremely important, the Philadelphia Convention, which convenes for the first time, obviously in Philadelphia, in May of 1787. Now, this becomes what we will sometimes refer to, what often just gets referred to as the Constitutional Convention. But they don't call it that immediately because that's not why they're there. They would not have thought that it was a constitutional convention at first. Their purpose at this Philadelphia Convention, at least at the very beginning, their purpose was to revise the Articles of Confederation. That's why they are there. That is the stated purpose of the meeting, to revise the Articles of Confederation. What does that mean, to revise? Yes. To fix. To just, handle a couple of things, to make a couple of changes. When you revise your paper, you don't delete it and throw it in the trash. You just go through and fix the things that need to be addressed. And that's what they were hoping to do here. They invite, delegates from all of the states. All but one attend of the states. We'll get to which one in a second, some of you know. And it's some of the same people. They're in the same room where the Second Continental Congress had met, where the Declaration of Independence had been approved. Some of the same individuals representing their states, some different people, some that are quite young, some that have been off fighting the war, like George Washington is there. And they're all there representing their state and their state's interests, and many of them are already coming ready for a fight, ready to defend certain principles that they believe very strongly, and ready to defend certain principles that their state believes, and defend their state's power and all that sort of stuff. One of the delegates to the Constitutional Convention, who coming in was rather an unknown, someone that was a little too young to have been part of the Second Continental Congress and all of that, but one that comes into the convention with a little bit of a different idea about what needs to be done, and a very well-organized idea about what needs to be done, is James Madison. James Madison is from Virginia, so he's one of the Virginia delegates like Washington. Madison comes in with the idea that the government needed to be strengthened very, very much, and he will propose an idea that later they will go with, but his contributions to all of this are going to end up being so great. James Madison is sometimes referred to as the father of the Constitution. So among his many things he's known for, is he later becomes called the father of the Constitution. What do you think people are saying about him if they call him the father of the Constitution? He kind of does a lot of it, or sort of, a lot of it is his doing. The basic outline is kind of his idea, and then it gets sort of tweaked from there. He probably contributes to it greater than any other single delegate. And a lot of you recognize James Madison. We'll continue to talk about him a lot. He eventually becomes president himself. But he first kind of makes a name for himself here at the Constitutional Convention. And his idea is phrased in a proposal called the Virginia Plan. So James Madison authors what becomes known as the Virginia Plan. It's called the Virginia Plan because Madison's from Virginia. So Madison proposes a couple of days into the convention this Virginia Plan. And first of all, the Virginia Plan was quite shocking to many of the delegates because, for one thing, the Virginia Plan would involve throwing out the Articles of Confederation and writing a new constitution. So that's kind of the first principle here, is that this would mean throwing out the Articles, doing away with that, and writing a whole new constitution, which makes some people at the convention go crazy right there. Because remember, that was not what they were there for, not what the authority was given to them for. But Madison is of the belief, and he wasn't alone in this. There were plenty of others that believed the Articles of Confederation couldn't be fixed, that it was too broken, that it was just a bad idea from the beginning, and they would do better to just throw it out and start all over again. And here's kind of the basic outline of the Virginia Plan. So, okay, we're going to throw out the Articles, write a new constitution. First of all, he is proposing a three-branch government. Three-branch government. How many did you have under the Articles? Just the one. So he's saying we go with a three-branch government. Whose idea was that originally? Montesquieu, so he's using Montesquieu's idea. Again, most states already have things this way, so it's not revolutionary exactly. The states are doing it, so he wants to do this at the national level. So as well as having a Congress, we're going to add an executive, and we're going to add a judicial branch, court system. He also is proposing that in Congress, in that legislative branch, that it be two houses, okay, two-house Congress, two chambers. And remember, under the Articles, it was just one. So he proposes a two-house Congress, and he also is suggesting that representation in that Congress be based on population. He's saying that representation in that Congress should be based on population. What does that mean if they're going to base it on population? Exactly. So that would mean the more people living in a state, the more delegates they would get, the more representation that they would get in that Congress. So who's going to benefit from that? The bigger states. Okay, Virginia was a bigger state. Now it's easy to go, well, oh yeah, Madison would like that. He's from Virginia. That means Virginia is going to get more votes than everybody else, and as well as other bigger states like New York and Pennsylvania. And you can say that, but truly, Madison believed that the national government was meant to be a representation of the people, that it was not meant to be a representation of states. And the only way for it to truly represent the people was to make it proportional. And you can see how states like Virginia may have complained about the Articles situation where every state was the same. Saying, we've got more people, it's not fair that we get one vote, and then, the small state like Rhode Island, for example, gets one vote too. That means that our people's voice counts proportionally less. Now, there's lots of other things with this, but that's kind of the main gist of it. 3 branches, 2-house Congress, and base the representation in that Congress on population. So for the next couple of days, the delegates are wrestling back and forth, and arguing about whether or not to go with Madison's Virginia plan or with a competing plan, which called for keeping the Articles and just making some changes. But ultimately, as we know, they're going to adopt Virginia plan and then spend the rest of the summer of 1787 locked up in this room in Philadelphia in the heat of the summer, ironing out all the details. Now, the competing plan that I mentioned, I got ahead of myself, sorry, was a plan called the New Jersey plan. The New Jersey plan would have, we're not going to go into too many details about it, but it would have kept the Articles of Confederation and just added, some more powers, just given the national government a few more powers like taxation and a few things like that, but overall keeping the basic structure of each state represented the same, and most of the individual power being with the states. And you'll notice in New Jersey, how much you describe that state as far as its size. It's a little on the small side. It's one of the smaller states. So which states do you think liked the New Jersey plan? The smaller states. The smaller states would more likely prefer that because they would see that as a better way to preserve their own power. They're not going to have to give up too much power to a national government. Virginia plan is going to be more favored by the larger states because they would see that they're going to get more representation in that government. Again, we know that after a couple of days, they decide to go with the Virginia plan, and then are going to spend the rest of that summer ironing out the details. And that's just where the fighting begins. So they are going to then spend, like I said, the next couple of months arguing about everything you can possibly argue about, down to the wording and the punctuation and all of that. They fight about everything they could possibly fight about because everybody came with very passionate opinions and very strong beliefs about what they think needed to happen and what didn't need to happen. And some of those disagreements were easier to work out than others. And oftentimes the Constitution is referred to as a bundle of compromises. And what is a compromise? Yes.
When two sides give up something to make an agreement.
Yeah, it's when we give up something to get some kind of an agreement. So in a compromise, does everybody get 100% of what they want? No. But we give in somewhere to get some kind of a final agreement. And it's most definitely true that the Constitution would not have been written had it not been for a couple of key compromises that allowed them to move past some issues and get something done. That also means the Constitution ends up, some things were not resolved and some things they didn't really get right. But it allows them to move past certain disputes. So there's many, many compromises. We're going to look at two of the biggest ones, the two that kind of caused the biggest trouble, that really threatened the future of the whole convention and how they were able to work that out. The first massive roadblock that they run into is a problem over representation in Congress. So they decided to go with Madison's proposal about a two-house Congress and all of that business. But we have the whole thing comes to a standstill for days, maybe longer, as we run into this issue about representation and how representation is going to be determined in that Congress. So this came down to a big state and a small state thing. What do you think the big states want? What kind of representation? Based on what? Population. So the larger states want representation based on population, like Madison. And you can see how they have a pretty strong argument for that. They say, we got more people. It's not fair, and I'm making these numbers up, but it's not fair for our 10 million people to be represented by one person when you've got, 100,000 people represented by one person. That means that our folks' voice counts for proportionately less. And so they felt that system under the Articles was not fair. What do the small states want? Yeah, the small states want it to be equal. They want it based on equality. One state, one vote. Everybody gets the same amount of votes. Everybody gets the same number of delegates. And you can see how they had a legitimate point there as well, because if it's done by population, what's going to happen to their voice? It gets drowned out. They're going to say, we don't want to be ruled over by all the big states. The big states will get everything they want. The big states like New York and Virginia and Pennsylvania, they're going to run everything. This is why one state didn't even show up to all of this. Can you guess which state didn't even come? Rhode Island. Okay, Rhode Island didn't show. How would you describe Rhode Island as far as size? A little bitty, okay. Because even though they didn't know immediately this was to throw out the Articles, they knew it was to strengthen the national government. And in a small state like Rhode Island wanted no part of that. They said, we're not even going to participate, because they didn't want to get swallowed up by that and be ruled over by that. So they're not even here. So they argue, and everybody's just sticking their heels in the ground, and Madison doesn't want to budge, and because, again, he feels that this is truly how a republic ought to work. It's not about the states. He's saying, forget the states. It's about the people. But ultimately realizes, because some of the small states are threatening to go home, they're threatening just to, cause this whole thing just to fold right there. Finally, they are able, someone, not Madison, but another individual, proposes what they call the Connecticut Compromise, because it was a guy from Connecticut that proposed it. We call it the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise, because this is the one that, among others, but the first one that really kind of saves the whole idea, saves the whole convention, and allows it to proceed forward, where they resolve this issue and compromise on this issue of representation. So here's what they agree in the Great Compromise. They agree that the lower house of Congress, which is the House of Representatives, okay, so we have two-house Congress, so the lower house is the House of Representatives, and the House of Representatives is based on population. So that House of Congress, the House of Representatives, that one is based on population. So in the House of Representatives, it depends on how many people live in a state as to how many delegates they get. That's one of the reasons we do the census every 10 years like we're doing right now, is to do that proportion kind of stuff. So larger states like Virginia and so forth, they're going to get more delegates. Okay, smaller states may only get one or two. Depends on the population, not the size of the state land-wise, but the amount of people who live in that state. Then you have the upper house of Congress. What do we call the upper house? The Senate. Okay, so we have the Senate, and in the Senate, it's equal. In the Senate, it is equal. In the Senate, every state gets the same number, which is 2, no matter how big or how small. So Alabama's got 2 senators, Rhode Island's got 2 senators, California's got 2 senators. So in representatives, Alabama has 7, Rhode Island has, I think, 2, and California has, I believe, 54. So it depends on the amount of people. Yes. I believe it is 2. I think 2. You certainly have 1 anyway, but I think it's 2. Or at least everybody has at least 2 for some reason. Okay, so that allows this to proceed forward. Another thing that they're also doing here, it's kind of a compromise over this question of who exactly does the legislative branch represent. It's a representation of people. That's what the House was originally meant for. That was the people's house. That's where the people's voice was voiced. Because the House was always directly elected by the people as well, whereas the Senate originally, this has changed, but the Senate originally was kind of meant as a representation of states, as that is where state governments were represented, because for a long time, senators were not elected the way that we elect them now. The states appointed them. That didn't change to the 20th century, actually. And so it was also kind of seen as this one represents the people, this one represents the state governments. So that allows them to proceed forward, but then they will immediately run into another problem over how you count people and what counts and what doesn't, and we're going to pick up with that one tomorrow. And look at that compromise and then a few other principles that they put in. All right. Questions? All right. So